Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to episode 58, Carl Banks of the Sports Consiglieres. I am Jerry Keller. Jimmy is away on assignment today. We are honored and privileged, I should say, to have somebody we've been trying to get on our show a long time. Probably needs no introduction among the Giant fan base. Somebody who's been covering the team for over 30 years. Currently has a podcast, Locked On Giants. You will see her work on many, many platforms, sportsillustrated.com, The Athletic, Forbes, the Bleacher Report, and the author of one of my favorite books. Every time I get to number 43, I still cry to this day, which was the end of Eli's streak. The Big 50, the men and moments that pretty much made the New York Giants. We welcome to the program. Very excited to have on Patricia Traina. Hello, Patricia.
Hello, how are you?
Good. So we have you on about 20 days before the start of training camp. And before we get into what I'll say, a lot of things are the obvious. One of the recent articles, I was surprised and not surprised to see Shane Bowen ranked as the 27th defensive coordinator in the NFL. I didn't think the Giants were stellar, far from awful. I was surprised to see him ranked that low. What do you think, besides, obviously, he's got some new toys, Adebo, Holland, Carter. What do you think he needs to do to really improve this unit from last season?
Well, he's got to optimize what he has. We could sit here and we could say, well, he didn't really have the same personnel that he had in Tennessee when his defenses were so good. But that's kind of what your job is, to figure it out and get the most out of what you had. Now, some of it was related to injuries. You can't lose a Dexter Lawrence. You can't lose a Bobby Okereke and expect to, have your unit perform at a high level. You can't have Deonte Banks decide to play one week and not decide to play the next week. So there were some issues beyond Bowen's control, but, he's got a lot more talent. I always say that this past offseason, he got a lot of love from General Manager Joe Schoen, who, if you remember in the episode of Hard Knocks, they were sitting at the combine, and Joe Schoen basically said to him, well, I'll get you Brian Burns, but that's all you're going to get. And it turned out that it wasn't enough. So this year he gave him a lot more. He gave him help on all three units across the board from front to back. Shane Bowen has got to optimize and get the most out of that talent.
Absolutely. And I think, too, like they say, usually when a head coach is in trouble, before he gets fired, he'll make a coordinator change. So you look at Shane Bowen, I think Jerome Henderson kind of took the fall last year, if you will, right, for Banks. So he's really out of chances, so to speak, and it's really on him. Like you said, I thought they had a very, very good offseason. I'm very optimistic about what they did on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, you look at, what he has coming off the edge, up the middle, like you said, front to back. I was just, were you surprised at the ranking? I was surprised he was ranked that low.
I didn't do the ranking, just be clear.
Right.
It was right. Yeah. Was I surprised? Not really. I mean, I kind of was, but I wasn't. And the reason why I was is because I didn't think the defense was the problem last year. I thought the offense was the bigger problem. But that said, they couldn't stop the run. All right. They had problems with getting off the field on third down. Some of the sloppiness we saw with penalties and discipline-related stuff, that all kind of lies on the coaching. So it wasn't all Shane Bowen. It was a conglomeration of various factors that kind of just made for the perfect storm, if you will. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to, be held accountable. And usually when an organization doesn't do well, they usually look at the top guys or gals as to the reason why. So that's kind of why, I think Shane Bowen fell into that bottom third.
Absolutely. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they run defense, like you said, which was atrocious. I think they finished 24th. If I'm not
I think
mistaken.
it was 27th. I could
27?
be wrong.
Okay, yeah. Maybe 24th overall, maybe. Maybe I'm
It
correct.
might have been, yeah. I look,
27th
I
in the
wrote
run.
it down, and I can't remember the numbers, but it's 27 is for some reason the number sticking in my head. But
Very, very, very unflattering. Now to flip the other side of the ball, I'm optimistic. I don't know how many Giant fans are really optimistic because I think, they brought in, I thought they had a very, very good offseason. And I think for me, what kind of pulls down my optimism is the schedule. Okay. But the schedule is what it is. We'll get to that later. What do you think? What did you see in the spring from Russell Wilson that you think he's going to be maybe a little bit better? I didn't think he was that bad. Denver was Denver. I didn't really think he was that bad in Pittsburgh. But what do you think the type of year that you expect him to have just so far based on what you saw in the spring?
well, I'm optimistic. I think one of the things I saw from Russell Wilson is that he can hit a receiver in stride. We didn't see it that often, with the last few quarterback groups this team has had, except
Right.
for maybe Tyrod Taylor. I think Tyrod Taylor was good at that. But as you know, if you can't hit a receiver in stride, if you're going to force that receiver to come back for the ball or to slow down his route or to stop in his route, that's going to give the defense an advantage because that split second that you've got to delay to catch the ball, now the defender can come over and he can limit the yards after the catch. We didn't really see that as much in the spring. We saw Wilson connecting on the deep ball in stride. I think that's going to be an underrated but significant difference in the offense if he is able to keep that up once we get into the regular season.
Now, I heard you recently speak about the offensive line. Now, what will Russell Wilson do? Because I think, barring any unforeseen circumstances, would you agree the same 5 individuals are going to start the season?
I think that's the plan, for continuity purposes, but you're also going to see some competition. I don't think the guard spot is necessarily set. I could see a scenario where if, Evan Neal successfully converts to guard, I mean, the guy can run block. Let's not sell him short in that area. Where he's got to step up is in pass pro. That's been his Achilles heel. But, are we going to see a situation where maybe Evan Neal comes on and now they put him next to Andrew Thomas on the left side and they flip John Runyon Jr. over to the right side. And then they say to Greg Van Roten, okay, man, you're going to be our first guy off the bench at guard and center. I could see that being the scenario. But as you know, with offensive lines, if you can get continuity, that's always preferred. But the drawback here is the Giants' offensive line, as configured down, as projected to be the starter, they only played together, 5.5 games before
Correct.
Andrew Thomas was injured.
Right.
So how much continuity can you really, say they established?
Right. And do you think that Neal has a legitimate shot to win that spot?
I think he's going to compete for that spot. He's a good run blocker. I don't know just yet with the pass pro, and we won't know until the pads go on, but that was his big, issue. And, Greg Van Roten, I asked him during the spring, I think one of the OTAs, I said to him, is it typically easier because you're working in a phone booth? And he goes, no, it is not. He says, you're facing big athletic defensive linemen. He says, trust me, I wouldn't want to be in a phone booth alone with guys like Dexter Lawrence.
Right.
So he kind of shot down that notion that it's easier to play inside because you are facing more athletic defensive linemen than maybe a generation ago.
Right. So at this point, I think we would both agree you're looking at 4 pretty much established guys that would be starting. The one guard spot might dictate a change there. So what does Russell Wilson do for an offensive line to quote unquote make them look better?
Well, he makes faster reads. That's probably the big thing. He gets the ball, he can quickly diagnose what's in front of him, what's going on, make a decision and get rid of the ball. It's not going to be like he drops back and now he's holding the ball going, okay, what am I looking at? Where do I go with the ball? And that was a problem we saw with the quarterbacks last year. That's also something, Jackson Dart is working to improve in, making progress there, but something he still needs to make, improve in, especially, when you have defenses that throw at you stunts and twists and all the fancy stuff and the disguises Russell Wilson can see through all that because he's been doing this for a long time now. So you would like to think that he's going to get the ball out of his hand quicker, make a quicker decision, make the right decision, and pick up some positive yards.
Now, sticking along with Russ, because I really like that move, and I really think that he's going to have a good year. I'm not even so I'm not what. So that leads me into my next question for you. So I think he's going to do well. I really do. I think he's going to do well under Dable. I like the wide receiver room. Realistically, what would he let's say he's playing very, very well. Where would the record have to go south for them to make a change to Dart, do you think?
I think they would probably by the second half of the season, they'd need to be like so far out of the race for a wild card spot. Maybe they would make the switch. I mean, if I had to take a guess, I would say maybe you see Dart after the bye week, give him like maybe the last 3 games, because look, you figure that the quarterback rotation, or not rotation, the quarterback depth chart is going to be Russ as QB1, Jameis Winston as QB2, Jackson Dart as QB3. If Jackson Dart is QB3, that means he's the emergency quarterback. He's not getting in the game unless quarterback 1 and quarterback 2 can't play. Correct. And there is no substitution for live reps. You can't simulate that in practice. You just can't simulate it even in virtual reality. So you would like to think at some point Jackson Dart is going to jump over Jameis Winston, because Jameis Winston, he's going to be QB2 this year. He's going to be QB2 next year. Correct. When Dart ultimately takes over.
Right.
So there's no shame in him being demoted to QB3 Correct. If it means getting Dart experience. But I think we won't see that until later in the year, unless the Giants are, in the thick of a playoff spot, the hunt for a playoff spot.
And you don't think, before we get back to Winston, you don't think it would ever be a situation like what Coughlin did, pulling Kurt Warner? The team was well alive for a playoff berth. They had a winning record. Let's say the Giants are 5-3. You don't see a scenario where they do something similar to what Coughlin did with Warner and Eli Manning.
I don't think so. And the reason why I say that is because the circumstances were a little different. Coughlin was that was his first year, 2004?
Correct.
Abel is 4th year? So the team's been going backwards. So I think the circumstances are a little bit different. I think there's a little bit more pressure to produce. You don't want to have another losing season, even though you could say, well, it was to get our rookie quarterback, experience and set up for the future. I don't think that's, the situations are the same, to be honest with you.
Correct. So now getting back to Winston, because I think a lot of people out there, they're like, well, where does he fit into the puzzle? But like you just addressed that, his deal is for 2 years. So in essence, he's the backup this year and he's the backup next year. I mean, that's really why he was brought in. I mean, everybody's like, oh, well, Dart's gonna hop Winston, but ultimately, like you said, he's Russ goes down, or week 1, week 2, they're not going to go to Dart. They would go to Winston, but Winston's deal is a 2-year deal, and he's going to be a backup quarterback for 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's the plan. And then the other thing you got to remember is that Winston, he's going to be on the bench with Dart. He's going to be in that kid's ear a lot, as will Dable probably. So you want to make sure that you have consistency. I don't think you want to suddenly say, okay, you know what, we're going to send Winston out there. I mean, unless you have to, obviously, but I think they would like to have some consistency in the voices that Dart is going to be exposed to, the information, the way they see things, so that they ultimately work more cohesively down the line.
Now, what have you seen in the spring? Give me like your biggest positive takeaway of seeing Dart throughout the spring.
Very confident, very humble, very businesslike. I think he's going to be a fine leader. I like his huddle presence, his huddle command. The guys that we spoke to, his receivers, offensive linemen, they all spoke glowingly of him. But he's also not the type of kid who's coming in here with an attitude. It's good to come in with a chip on your shoulder, but there's a fine line between having an attitude and a chip on your shoulder. And Dart's not coming in here thinking, well, I was a hot shot down in Tennessee, not Tennessee, I'm sorry, Ole Miss, so I should be the starter. He's not like that. He's like, okay, look, this is the first time in my career that I'm basically going to have to sit on the bench, but I understand why. I accept it. I'm willing to work at it and trust the plan that has been laid out for me because it makes sense. So in that regard, very mature, very professional, willing to do what it takes to become the quarterback that they all hope and know that he can become.
I absolutely. That's great. That's great to hear. Now, sticking on the offensive side of the ball, something that really caught my eye that you wrote about recently, and I couldn't believe it, is that on third down, the Giants only targeted their tight ends 19 times. So what do you now? I know Johnson was hurt, but I don't think that was the reason. I mean, do you think that's going to change? Is that something that, is because that's basically, I mean, their third down percentage was poor, but, that really blew me away. I mean, that's a little over one time, a game. What do you think? I mean, do you think last year it was just the offense was just so poor? Is that a more stronger role that you think a healthy Theo Johnson can, somebody that they can rely on third down, or how do you see that stat improving?
Yeah, I think last year with Theo Johnson, the coaches just kind of threw everything at him, and it was a sink or swim type of situation. And if you recall, in the beginning, he was sinking a little bit, but then he kind of got his footing underneath him, and he started to swim, and he started to see a bigger role, not just as a blocker, but also in the passing game. And then he had the injury. So, Theo Johnson, he's very athletic. That big body does a great job of shielding the ball and getting between the ball and defenders. He can pick up the yards after the catch. I think that's kind of why he moved a little bit ahead of Daniel Bellinger, because Bellinger doesn't quite have the same level of athleticism. So I think, you get a healthy Theo Johnson get through the entire year. Maybe that's a little wrinkle that they add back to the offense. I mean, I don't have, I know I wrote it down somewhere on my desk here. I wrote down the receivers and what they did on third downs. I didn't get into the really deep details, but yeah, that kind of, was an eye opener for me as well. When I was going through, the internet for story ideas. And when I started to really dig into it, I was like, wow, that's kind of weird because, you think of tight ends, send the tight end up the seam, especially in the red zone, you want them to be a weapon. And to me, they were underutilized last year. And that could be because Theo Johnson, they were trying to, throw him into on-the-job training and expedite that. And then, of course, you had the injury. So.
Right. Now, sticking on the offensive side of the ball, I like the receiver room. Who is one receiver that you think is going to benefit right away from playing with Russell Wilson?
Well, the easy answer would be Jalen Hyatt because there seems to be a connection there. Jalen Hyatt is the type of receiver, I spoke about earlier about how the problem with the quarterbacks last year and the year before that is that they didn't hit guys in stride. And I think Jalen Hyatt is the type of receiver that you need to hit in stride. And if you can do that, maybe you can get something out of him. You can help him with tracking the ball, because now if you have to have him stop or come back for a pass, it can be a little, create disorientation for a receiver. So Jalen Hyatt's been really working at it. He added some muscle, which should hopefully help with contested catches and just, downfield blocking, which is another role for a receiver. But there seems to be a connection that developed there. But, Malik Neighbors, even though he didn't practice all spring long, he's a guy who will adapt to any quarterback, because he's just that good. Don't sleep on Darius Slayton. I think Darius Slayton is underrated and has been virtually all his Giants career.
I agree.
I think, Wan'Dale Robinson even, will we see him more on the outside like he wants to be? Well, Russell Wilson typically doesn't throw the ball to the middle of the field a whole lot. I forget what the stats were, but most of his passes went outside the numbers. So maybe they move Wan'Dale Robinson now and take advantage of those throws outside the numbers to maybe, generate a little bit more offense.
Now, do you see with the receiver room, do you see guys becoming interchangeable from the outside to the slot and vice versa?
I think that's what they want to do, but that said, when one of the things that makes me laugh when I hear next man up, we're all human. We're not robots. We weren't all manufactured with the same parts and the same mindset and the same characteristics. So everybody does something a little bit better than everybody else and a little less better than everybody else. So that being said, I think that's what they want to do. I think it's just a matter of figuring out, okay, if we're going to put Wan'Dale Robinson on the outside, what routes can't he run as well as, say Malik, or, where's his limitations, if any, and what do we need to coach him up in? So that's kind of what they have to figure out.
And if I'm not mistaken, the reason where my next question is going, I think in his career, like Russell Wilson throwing to the slot, like his completion percentage is like through the roof. So that's why I was at, I didn't know if you foresaw like a situation like if, just to get a guy like, Jalen Hyatt involved, like more involved, would they put him, into the slot as opposed to being the quote unquote outside deep threat?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't hurt to move guys around. I've been calling for them to throw to put Malik Neighbors in the slot. I think that's an area where Malik Neighbors can really, do some damage. You could, why limit them to just one role?
Right.
If you've got these talents, why not move them around? So I think that's just something they have to figure out.
And would you say, based on the reports, I mean, obviously you're there, that Hyatt did come in, like you said, he put on the muscle, but he has like a little resurgent bounce to him. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Very determined. A lot of people I don't think know this. I've heard that he really, during the spring, he put in extra time to work on those areas of his game where he was lacking. And coaches take note of that. If you're staying after school, so to speak,
right,
you're working with the jugs machine, or you're running routes, or you're studying film, they take notice of that. And, you're going to earn more opportunities, because that's basically what you're showing them. You're showing them that, hey, I want more opportunities to show that what I've been working on can transfer over to, what you're asking of the receivers to do.
Right. Now, flipping back to the backfield, Tracy, definitely a huge surprise, his overall performance. You think he can get to 1,000 yards rushing?
I think so. The run blocking last year by the offensive line wasn't as sharp as you maybe would have liked it to see. But I think with the right combination of guys in there and better, technique and whatnot. And again, remember last year, a big problem with the offensive line is when the injuries started, they didn't really have any quality depth ready to step in. So when you plug guys in, there was a noticeable drop off in the performance. This year, they've addressed that. So if heaven forbid there's an injury, if Andrew Thomas goes down again, and let's hope, knock on wood, he doesn't, they've got guys who have played left tackle before. They don't have to say, okay, we can't find a left tackle, but maybe we'll get lucky. We'll plug a guy who's been a career right tackle in for Andrew Thomas and hope for the best. Right. That was part of the problem. But, the big thing, and this is something that I screamed about for a number of years, is the Giants just didn't have quality young talent waiting in the wings to develop. And I kept saying, why don't they do this? Why don't they add to the group? They keep going the veteran route. It's not working. Right. This year, they have done that. They added Marcus Bowe, who can play. He's going to start at tackle, I believe, but he can also play inside at guard. They are looking to develop Evan Neal as a guard. All right. He can also play, tackle if they need him to in an absolute pinch. Not that I think they would. I think that ship has sailed. I think they're going to hopefully try and, settle in on a spot for Joshua Azudu, who has just been inconsistent. But then again, he's been playing out of position as well. And then, of course, don't forget about guys like Jake Kubas, who, flashed last year. So they've got some young talent they can work with. And the idea is just to build them up so that if there is an injury, they can slide guys around and not lose a step.
Now, it's funny. We keep every time we talk about the offense, we keep touching back to Evan Neal because I think he's one of the more polarizing guys, the last 4 years. Obviously, goes without saying where he was drafted. Do you feel the transition to guard should have been done sooner?
Oh yeah, it was supposed to be done last year, but if you remember, he had the setback in the spring with his coming off ankle surgery, missed most of training camp. By that point, it just wasn't going to happen. But it was supposed to be done last year. So I think they knew it.
Right.
And that's why when it didn't happen, they were saying, well, he's a tackle. We'll work with him with tackle. Because at that point, they had no choice. They couldn't start from scratch with him. They had to just kind of salvage what they could of him at tackle. But I think they knew a lot sooner than, this year.
Right. Well, listen, if they're hoping for a repeat of Mekhi Becton. I mean, there is the chances of this happening, I wouldn't say are far fetched. I mean, I think Evan, that this, like you said, it should have happened, but the injury, derailed the plan, if you will. And, I really do think that he's going to do well there. If he starts, I don't know, but I think that, a position change is going to bode well for him. Now,
Yeah.
now we got, you got Tracy. He had over 1,000 total yards, last year. How much of an impact, or does he even stay around, you think Singletary will have?
I think to start the season, Singletary will be RB2 because the big thing with running backs that keeps them off the field, besides obviously health, is pass pro. If you cannot pick up a blitz, you're not getting on the field. That's gone on for years and years and years. So Cam Scatterboo, I believe in college, was not too bad at picking up the blitz. But as you know, the NFL is a little different than the college level. The other problem with Cam Scatterboo is he did not practice for most of the spring. I don't know what his ailment was. I don't know how severe it is, but he lost a lot of time. Now, if he comes in for training camp in a couple weeks and he's good to go, he'll catch up. I'm not worried about that. But if he starts off on PUP and can't practice and the days lead into weeks, then you got to say, okay, just realistically speaking, how much of a role is he going to have? So, with Devin Singletary, he is the best pass pro they have amongst the running backs. He's a solid running back. He can get you the yards. He could, he works best, I think, inside the tackles. Not too bad as a receiver either. So I think to start things off, he's definitely going to get his share of reps. They like him. They know him from Buffalo, obviously. Shane and Dable do. So I think, reports of Devin Singletary's demotion to RB3 or even off the roster are premature.
Okay. And now putting this all together, I know Mike Kafka has been acting, I guess is the right word, as the offensive coordinator during the spring. Do you think he goes back and he's calling the plays?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. And I think it makes sense because Brian Dable is taking a hands-on approach with Jackson Dart. And when you are the offensive play caller, that takes a big chunk out of your day, planning and revising and talking and all that stuff. So even though Brian Dable likes to call plays, it makes sense for him to give that role back to Kafka so that Dable can now be freed to work with Jackson Dart. To also, another problem they had, and I don't think this is talked about enough, defense and special teams weren't that great last year either. So maybe now Dable has a little bit more time during his day to get more involved with those meetings, as opposed to blocking himself in his office with his charts and making up that menu every week.
Right. Especially this year, because I mean, he is invariably, I would say, coaching for his job. I mean, I know, everybody has a differing opinion of how much progress he would have to make or what is progress. With that being said, another thing I wanted to touch upon, going in a totally different direction, because it kind of surprised me. Another thing that you've written about recently is the Giants' injury woes weren't as bad in 24 as they were in 23. right? But
Yeah.
yet they really made an overhaul from physicians to the strength. I mean, they promoted Drew Wilson to the strength and coordinating director. Were you surprised by that? Because, well, first of all, I was surprised that 23 was better than 24. Because again, you lost Singletary. It just gave you the perception that, you lost Thomas, that a lot of guys were hurt. But do you think that that's something that should have been done, long ago, if you will, the overhaul of the strength and conditioning and some of the medical people, if you will?
Well, you have to remember some of those positions or the overhaul, some of that, guys just left.
Okay.
It wasn't that they were fired. The guys just left. I think one of the strength coaches, and I can't remember who, went to, I think it was Pirano, I think it was. He rejoined Mike Vrabel up in New England.
Right.
So, that was part of it. But, the injury situation, look, I tell people this every year. Every team gets injured. It's just something you can't avoid. Now, where it factors in and where it becomes really noticeable is in who is getting injured. If you lose Andrew Thomas, you're going to notice that. If you lose Dexter Lawrence, you're going to notice that. Bobby Okereke, you're going to notice that. Malik Neighbors, you will notice that. But if you're losing guys, and I hate to say this because they're just as important to the roster, but you got to put it in perspective. But if you're losing guys who are at the bottom of the depth chart at their respective roster spots, and they're not really getting a whole lot of, opportunities in the game, you probably won't notice that as much. So injuries, people could look at the numbers and the man games lost and all that stuff, but ask yourself who they are losing and, how big of a loss that is. I remember doing this study like a few years ago. I went back and I looked at the 2007 Giants Super Bowl team. They had over 21 guys, I think, on injured reserve.
Okay.
Then did it stop them from winning? It didn't. Why? Because most of the guys that were on injured reserve that year, they were towards the back end of the depth chart at their respective positions. So it's all in who you lose as opposed to the number, I think.
Right. It's funny. That's, right there. That's obviously 21's a big number. And I'll never forget, like it was yesterday, when Coughlin got hired, he pretty much, if you remember, indirectly blamed Fossil for the Giants always having injuries. And one of the things that he said at the time was that he was getting rid of all the machines, if you will, in the weight room, like the hammer strength. And he was going back, to a more like, a barbell, dumbbell, that type of situation. So, I mean, like, again, you talk about the injuries, and I know, some people always take the hit, like you said, teams are always revamping and people are always leaving. But I would like to think that all 32 teams, are doing the same thing in preseason, in the offseason to limit the injuries. And, injuries are a part of the game. But, the point I wanted to make is that I was blown away that 24 wasn't as really bad as 23. Shifting gears a little bit, we're about, I think it's 20 days to the day for training camp. What do you think going into training camp is the biggest story? Is it the offensive line? Is it the quarterbacks?
I think it's just overall improvement. This is probably, and again, no trophies are ever given out during the preseason. But I can honestly say this roster, when I look at it, there's not a whole lot that I sit there and I say, oh my gosh, what are they going to do here? It's a strong roster. So it's a matter of now taking all these ingredients and putting them together and improving. So I don't think, there's any one big story. I know some people will say, well, how are they going to get Abdul Carter on the field? Matter of fact, I'm working on a piece now in which Pro Football Network says that the biggest competition is going to be at the outside linebacker spot. And I disagree with that. Now, I'll write why in my article. You can also say, okay, well, maybe the offensive line, there's a competition there. But I think the big picture, Joe Shane has added so much talent across the board. There's no reason why this team shouldn't be more competitive and a lot better than they were last year. And if they're not, then you got to look at the coaching. You got to look at, okay, were the other circumstances that dragged this team down? But I can honestly say, looking at this roster, there's really, what may be the exception of safety. I think the depth there is still a little iffy, but I'm curious about this Makari Page guy that they signed as an undrafted free agent, but I don't think you can honestly say that there's any position now on the Giants offense or defense and even special teams, we'll throw that in there, where you can say, okay, I have questions about how this is going to work out.
Would you agree with the following statement that on paper, heading into 25, this team is better than the wild card team?
I think so. Quarterback is better. They've got a little bit better pass rush.
Receivers are better.
The receivers are better. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Now getting to this, roster's better. Optimism is up. You got Russell Wilson coming in. You got Dart. There's a lot of nice pieces that were added. How do you think coming out of the gate, right? 2 division games, back to back on the road. Then they come home to a prime time Kansas City, and then they have the Chargers at home. So how do you see what would be the best case scenario? Heading into this year I should say, what would be the realistic scenario? First 4 years.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I'm actually working on an article about why I think this whole argument that the Giants are doomed because they have a difficult schedule is kind of bogus. If you think about it, they have played Washington tight. All right. Last year, they were one healthy kicker away from winning that first game.
Agreed. Yep.
And I think they lost, both games, if I'm not mistaken, each game they lost that by less than 7 points, if I remember correctly. So Washington, I think the Giants can play them, stay in the game with them. The Saints, I know, are in that first 6-week stretch. Who's going to be the quarterback for the Saints? Even though, that's been a house of cards. The Giants have been 5-10 when they go down to New Orleans. But if they don't have a quarterback, look, the Giants know all about not having good quarterback play or stable quarterback play and what that could do to you. So that's a winnable game. Denver, I think, is outside of that first 6 games. But Denver, they're playing in London the week before, and they're not taking a bye. So maybe some jet lag sets in. Maybe the Giants can take that game, surprise a few people. I started working on Kansas City and, just breaking down what Kansas City did last year, because everybody's like, oh, Kansas City, they're going to be favored by 100 points. Kansas City's average margin of victory was 7.1 points. Okay, that's not blowout. All right, so if you think that, okay, maybe the Giants are a little bit better, maybe they get the pass rush, and there's also a stat that I have coming out in this article I'm working on where if you're able to get, I think it's 3 or more sacks against Kansas City, their margin of victory now shrinks. And I think it's down to like 3 point something. So if you can keep it manageable and not shoot yourself in the foot with mistakes, which the Giants did all too often, there might be some games here that, you look on the schedule and you say, oh, there's no way they're going to win this, that maybe they might surprise a few people.
Yeah, the problem with that Kansas City game for me is I really don't like watching the Giants in prime time.
Neither do I, but it is what it is.
It is what it is.
Everybody knows I hate primetime games, but
so shifting gears, I mentioned getting a little personal here. So I mentioned the book before, which I really enjoyed. My wife got me this, when it came out. You, another favorite of mine, Ernie Accorsi, wrote the foreword. You dedicated this to your dad. Like we mentioned, the start of the show, 30 plus years covering the Giants. Out of your career, who was the biggest influence, on your career?
Oh gosh, so many people. My father obviously got me into watching the Giants and loving the Giants. I can remember many Sundays just sitting there with him, watching the games on TV. He was also a season ticket holder for a number of years. And he was very patient with me, because, when you watch the game, you don't want to have a little kid asking you 50 million questions. And that was me.
Right.
I was asking 50 million questions, and he would explain everything to me and just help me develop an appreciation for the team. And I'll tell you something. I don't think a lot of people know this, but it's kind of on record, I think, somewhere. Back in the day, I don't know if you remember, the Giants flagship radio station used to have a contest where if you sent in like a poem or a song about the Giants, you could win tickets. I did that, and I actually won twice.
Nice. Now, was that WNEW?
Yeah, it was on WNEW.
Okay.
But it's funny. The second time when I won, I was just starting my sports writing career, and I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't go on. So I remember having my sister-in-law read my poem. But yeah,
Awesome.
I did creative writing when I was in college. I did poetry and short stories and all that stuff. So I said, you know what, I'm going to just send it in, because I would listen to some of the entries and I'm like, I think I'm just as good as some of those authors. And sure enough, I would win. I won twice, and it was cool because I got to go on the radio and read off my, my entry. And I still have one it's an ode to the 1986 team, which I have. It's ingrained in my head, and it was probably the best one that I ever did. The second one I don't remember as well, but the first one, that's always going to be with me.
Nice. I remember, like, I was a kid, WNEW, you had Dick Lynch, right? Jim Gordon was the play-by-play guy, right? And then after, in the post-game, I believe Dave Jennings was the post-game guy that would go in the locker room. So, it wasn't that long ago. So out of your whole time covering the Giants, who was your favorite player to interact with?
Oh, there's been so many. There really has been. I can't sit here and say that I have one specific favorite. I think for me, the most rewarding thing is when they leave the game and then you run into them down the line and they remember you, not just because of your face, but they remember your name. And that's, like, I'll tell you a funny story. Well, this year during the I think it was during the OTA, Michael Strahan came in, and he was one of the players, the legends, invited to talk to the team. And Strahan was standing we were in the field house. So there's like a lobby before you go into the main field house. And Strahan was standing there, and he was talking with Paul Dottino, who's been around longer than I have. And he turned around and he saw me, and and his face lit up. Hey, and he came over and gave me a big hug. He called me by name, asked me how I was. Just that's so rewarding. And it says to me that, I did right, that I'm doing things the right way. When players remember you by name and they ask about, how you're feeling, they remember details about you. Like, at the time, later on, 2011, I was dealing with cancer. So, they know, how are you? Is your health good? Are you still in remission? So it's all about the people aspect of it and how you treat people. And I don't look to burn people. I look to build relationships up, because look, you never know when you're going to need to ask them something down the line, just like they never know if they're going to need to ask you something down the line. Right. And that respect to me that I get from former players is just so invaluable, and I cherish it.
No, absolutely. One hand washes the other, and shifting a little bit. How about who was one of your favorite coaches to deal with, or who was? I don't want to put you on the spot, but who would you say is one of the more personable coaches with the media?
With the media as a whole, I think Tom Coughlin got a little bit better towards the end there. Jim Fossil was also pretty good. That's really, I came onto the scene right about towards the end of the Dan Reeves era. So my exposure would have started with Fossil, but Fossil was good. He was definitely, media friendly. Coughlin got better as time went on. I got along well, believe it or not, with Ben McAdoo and Joe Judge. I know some people had problems with those two guys. I didn't. And Dable, I get along with Dable as far as I know, there's a mutual respect there. And, I'll tell you this story. The first year It was right. We were still in the COVID era. And the first year, it was summer training camp, and I had to sit down with Joe Shane. And then I went out to the field, and I wasn't feeling well. I was feeling like I was starting to get a cold, but at the time I was like, yeah, it's probably the heat. So I go through practice, and then I go home, and my husband, I see my husband. He says, "Oh, I tested positive for COVID," and my face went pale. I'm like, "Oh man, if you tested positive, that means I'm going to get it." Well, sure enough, I tested positive for COVID, and I felt absolutely horrible because I just sat with Joe Shane, and God forbid I had gotten him sick. So I remember emailing Giants PR, and I said, "Hey, just a heads up, my husband tested positive for COVID. I'm testing positive for COVID now. I sat with Joe. You might want to give him a heads up." Well, long story short, the next day I get a phone call from Brian Dable asking me how I'm doing. He said, "I heard you tested positive for COVID. How are you?" This in the middle of training camp when he could have been in meetings or whatever. And I was like absolutely blown away. I was like, wow. So, he was nice enough to reach out to me. Joe Shane did also reach out to me, although by a text. And I was so remorseful. I was like, I am so sorry. I said, honest to God, I did not know. If I had known, I never would have sat with you. Thankfully, Joe didn't get sick. Thankfully, nobody got sick that I know of. But that just goes to show you, Dable was very personal, and I have a great deal of respect for him. So
that's a great story about, two little anecdotes about both those guys. Because for someone like me looking on the outside, that knowing what you just said or hearing what you just said, that doesn't surprise me because they do seem like genuinely nice guys. So that, again, that doesn't surprise me. So quick question. Do you have any other big things that you're working on now? Any books or just the daily grind?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing over on New York Giants on SI, we're doing player previews so that when you hear a name, you don't say, "Who's that?" You can just check out the site and you can see every guy is covered. I'm working on the biggest what I call the biggest false narratives of the off season. So right now I mentioned I'm working on that schedule piece. So I'm almost done with that. I'm working on a competition piece. Again, that's a false narrative. And then over on Locked On Giants, which is the podcast I host, I'm doing position unit previews. So basically where they were lacking last year, what they need to really address. Then I'm looking at the key personnel and the expectations. So that's going on. At some point before training camp, I hope to get a guest on from the NFL Network. I'm not sure who it's going to be, but I have to follow up with them. So yeah, we just continue to roll along, and as news pops up, we cover it. We do a little bit of aggregation here and there, but we're trying to do more original, insightful stuff. You mentioned the tight ends piece. That's something I'd seen on the internet that I dove into. The injuries piece, that was something I saw that I dove into. So really, it's just keeping up with the flow, and we put new content out every single day on New York Giants on SI.
Right, and I love the Instagram page as well.
Yeah, that too.
So, Patricia,
listen,
we're going to close out the show. I just want to say this was a lot of fun for me. Thanks for coming on. We look forward to hearing you again, and obviously we will be following you, as we do now. Again, everyone, Patricia Traina, 30 years covering the New York Giants. Catch her on Locked On Giants, her podcast on SI.com, The Athletic, Forbes, and Bleacher Report. So this was episode 58. 58, we only have one person that we reference for that number, which is Carl Banks. Jimmy and I will be back together really soon. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We look forward to training camp. And Patricia, happy 4th of July to you and your family, and happy 4th of July to all our listeners. And that is the close for episode 58. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.